My name's Celia Stubbs. I was the partner of Blair Peach, who was killed by a policeman in Southall in April 1979. And it was leading up to an election, and the National Front booked Southall Town Hall for an election meeting. And the people of Southall, the Southall Youth Movement, sent out a message for people to come and support them. That's why Blair and I went there. He was hit on the head by a policeman and was taken to Ealing Hospital and died that night. In July, Commander Cass, he was given the job of doing a report about what had happened at Southall, and of course, when the inquest came up, the coroner didn't allow us to see this report, which made a total mockery of the inquest.
So an inquest is meant to be an inquisitorial investigation into the circumstances of how someone died. It's led by a coroner, and the coroner is looking at the 4 key questions of who died, when they died, where they died, and how they died.
And the how is the difficult bit that has beleaguered inquests right from the word go. How you define, how widely you define the word how.
It's meant to be non-adversarial, but it becomes adversarial because it's the state trying to protect their position and the families having to battle to find out the full details of how their loved one died.
Again and again and again, the one thing that families say is, I do not want this to happen to anybody else. Nothing can bring him or her back to me, but I can make sure, I hope, that no other family has to go through this.
Following his death, the family and friends of Blair Peach got to know other campaigns who'd had partners or relatives killed by the police or in prison. So we got together with 4 other organisations to form INQUEST. These 5 campaigns, we came together because we had similar problems. We had awful problems at the inquest with how the coroner treated us. We weren't given the police reports that were done, and also the concerns about many people, how they were going to pay for the inquest, because you couldn't get legal aid then. And so we just came together and formed this group. And it was really an ad hoc group, but it was sort of amazing.
You can produce name after name after name of people who have died in state institutions, be they prisons, be they mental health, be they police custody. INQUEST's main purpose was to provide support, really, for these families who had nowhere to go, and in those days couldn't even get a lawyer to represent them. And that's where INQUEST became crucial.
Everybody on the whole was working, full-time or part-time, so it was difficult. But in 1982 we applied and got a grant from the GLC, so we were able to employ 2 part-time workers. So we began to get known, and we began to get referrals from families.
I had worked with the campaigning organisation Women in Prison and was made aware of the fact that women were dying in prison. And when I saw a small advert for INQUEST, and I started in the early years as a caseworker, effectively working with a whole variety of families.
Deb Coles had started with INQUEST in 1989, and she and I became involved together. She was obviously very interested in these cases, and we then worked together on a number of cases in the North East where lawyers were not the slightest bit interested in doing this work and didn't see why it was being done.
My experience of working at women in prison was absolutely central to the way in which we developed the work at INQUEST. We saw the deaths of women in prison as an organisational priority because we were aware of the increasing numbers of women who were dying, the shocking circumstances of those cases, and the fact that we recognise the harmful and dangerous reality of prisons for women.
I acted for the family of a young woman called Emily Hartley, who was in Newhall prison in Yorkshire. And she suffered from mental ill health, and she was there because of an offence of arson. It's a form of self-harm, if you like, and she was sentenced and she was in prison. She was the most incredible young woman and wrote pages and pages of how she felt, what her demons were, how she felt that she was being treated in prison. She was extremely articulate. And I know you just wanna play. When she died, she had gone out on exercise with other prisoners. She never came back and was found later at the back of one of the buildings on the prison estate, having hung herself. But today I feel okay. Called you up just to hear you say, I still love you, babe. And I'm afraid that looking back over all the inquests I've done, it does seem that there is a link between these tragic deaths and why on earth the individuals are in prison in the first place. There were 6 deaths of women in Star Prison between 2002 and 2003. Women, many of whom were withdrawing from drugs, had addictions, mental ill health, who'd been put into a prison that simply was not fit for purpose.
My daughter died in prison. She was only 18, and she got to the prison on the Friday. She was dead the following night, and in that 24 hours she was vomiting, fitting, having cardiac arrests, bleeding from the nose and mouth at the point of death. And even though they knew she'd overdosed, several members of staff, including a nurse, walked out of the cell and locked the door on her.
INQUEST were involved with the families of those 6 women, and we campaigned for a public inquiry, which resulted in the Labour government setting up an independent review by Baroness Jean Causton. We were able to bring bereaved families to the table, and Baroness Causton could hear directly from those families.
My name's Pauline Campbell. My daughter Sarah, aged 18, died 3 years ago in the so-called Care of Style prison. Last month, in a highly unusual move, the Home Office finally admitted that it had breached my daughter's human rights, and they have admitted liability for her death. It took me nearly 4 years. I have in total now been arrested 14 times. I am handcuffed, dragged along the ground, locked in police cells and put before the courts. Shame on the establishment. Seeking to criminalise and punish me when I am a grieving mother whose only child has died at the hands of the state.
I have stood for so many minutes of silence in my time. I have stood for many 1 minute of silence for Blair Peach, Colin Roach and Emily Hartley. And every time I stand for them, the silence kills me. When I stand in silence for Sarah Campbell, Oliver Price or Ricky Reel, I am overwhelmed with honest militancy. I have danced to reggae with Mikey Powell. Now I stand in silence for Mikey Powell. 1 minute at a time, and every minute counts.
On the 15th of April 1989, 97 men, women and children were unlawfully killed following the Hillsborough football disaster. We expanded our remit to include mass fatalities because we wanted to ensure that those families had access to specialist lawyers.
Their deaths had initially been blamed on the fans, whereas it was the state, it was the police who were meant to be managing the stadium, managing the crowd control. They had failed in their duties to properly police the crowds and had allowed this disaster to happen.
I am sick of seeing on television and reading in the press these instant experts, doctors and a few lawyers who all seem to know more about our job than we do. This mob surged through and the vast majority of that lot had been drinking, the ones that were arriving late, and they will not be told where to go. They won't do anything you're trying to do.
So are you saying the fans are to blame then?
The police certainly aren't to blame.
After the Hillsborough disaster, certain newspapers portrayed those who died and those indeed who'd attended the match and survived in the most dreadful way, as having, as it were, caused the whole scenario. These slurs perpetuated and absolutely had to be put to rest.
My standout memory from working on Hillsborough was one of the very first meetings we had, and we had all these families for the 96, and they were incredibly angry and they wanted justice. And one of my clients just shouted out, "We know that you're going to get the unlawful killing." And there was, you know, the group of families just erupted in cheers, and they had so much faith in the lawyers. And I felt a really heavy burden on our collective shoulders that, you know, we didn't want to let these families down.
That inquest achieved unlawful killing verdicts in terms of what happened to the football supporters that day, and also put paid to these dreadful slurs that somehow the fans had been responsible for their own demise. It was specifically found it was totally the fault of the police organisation.
When the conclusion came out, there was just absolute rapture amongst the families. And it was just amazing. Years' work coming to this conclusion and reaching the right result.
So pen portraits were used in a huge way at the inquests into Hillsborough. A pen portrait is an opportunity for a family to talk about their loved one, remembering them in life, not just in death.
I remember you as a toddler in your new red wellies, jumping in puddles. The bigger the splash, the better. I remember those heated debates with your dad about social justice. I remember the way you looked after Vicky. You always looked after your little sister. even at the very end.
It can be a few words about the deceased when they were in life, can be photographs. It's important that the inquiry humanises the deceased. And what better way of humanising the deceased than knowing what they were like in life?
Pen portraits are something that INQUEST has fought for over the decades of our time, because we recognise the fact that in what is a very complex legal process, the reality of the person who's died, the fact that they were a human being who was loved by their family, is too often lost in a process that likes to demonise the deceased.
The people of Grenfell were failed, but nobody has been held to account.
The charred remains of Grenfell Tower loom over West London. Fire crews have been going from floor to floor. The higher they reach, the more bodies they discover.
Warnings this building was a fire trap apparently went unheard.
Now, a review into the Grenfell fire admitted the building regulations that allowed it to go up was the result of a broken system.
Many blame government spending cuts for a decline in safety standards.
My role in Grenfell was similar to my role in Hillsborough. I was representing a large cohort of families. The main similarity was the way that the families and the deceased were again demonised by the state and by the media. They were portrayed as undeserving, as illegal immigrants, as scroungers.
The Hillsborough families were then able to talk to the Grenfell families about why they felt it was so important to have pen portraits in framing what had happened and reminding not just those at the inquest, but also the wider public about the loss that those families had experienced.
Mehdi liked ice cream, curry and couscous. He kept a squishy red, white and blue rocket toy in his bed. Had he lived until adulthood, I think he would have liked to have been a comedian.
My beloved Ray was my modern-day Moses, my hero.
He looked like he was just sleeping, as babies do. You know, at that moment, we felt like our hearts had broken. So I held my son in my arms that evening, hoping it was all a bad dream, wishing, praying for any kind of miracle, always going to be a part of our lives.
I hear so much when I stand for a minute of silence. The truth is, I would rather shout for hours. I want to make a big noise for my sisters, mothers and brothers. I want to bear 1 million loved children to overrun the culture of cruelty. I want babies that will live for a lifetime. I don't want to silence their souls. I don't want them to be seen and not heard. I want them to be heard. I want them to be loud.
No justice! Doves to mark a peaceful vigil. The family of Mark Duggan, who was shot dead not far from Tottenham Police Station in August 2011, had appealed for calm. And on Saturday, protesters continued to reject an inquest verdict that he was lawfully killed.
When I was representing the Duggan family, Mark Duggan, who died in 2011, he was shot by police officers in North London. That was a really difficult experience, because another theme that has reoccurred throughout my career, and something that INQUEST has shone a light on, is the demonisation of the deceased. And during the Duggan inquest, this demonisation came from a number of different angles. Firstly, it was suggested that Mark had shot a police officer, and that was the justification for why Mark had been shot. It transpired that the police officer had been shot by his colleague, but they tried to suggest in the early stages that that was Mark who had done that. And you see, what then happens is the press pick up on that, report that widely, that gets distributed nationally, and once it's in the public conscious, it's very difficult to change that, to rebut it.
In my early days at INQUEST, when I was also doing casework, I worked on a number of deaths of black men who'd been unlawfully killed. Oliver Price, I remember as an early case that I did, and such was the force of the neck hold that was used against him. There was an indentation of his chain in his neck after the restraint, and that was one of the early unlawful killing verdicts that was returned.
In the late 90s, the concept of restraint or positional asphyxia was completely unknown of by British police. But because the numbers of black men who were dying from this sudden death, the scientists, the pathologists were providing every explanation apart from the obvious one staring them in the face. They were saying this was sudden adult death syndrome, a concept very similar to cot death syndrome, where you just suddenly keel over. The problem with that is there's nothing unique about me as a, black man of African descent that makes me more susceptible to dying, but for the fact that because of the colour of my skin, I am more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, more likely to be restrained if I had the unfortunate situation of encountering police officers. It was just simply racism.
It has always been a role here to both monitor who is dying and where they're dying, and importantly, to look at how structural racism and institutional racism has impacted on those deaths. So we've done a lot of thematic work looking at deaths of black men following the use of force in both policing, but also in the context of immigration and mental health settings.
Well, I'd rather not know INQUEST, the charity, but they helped from day one. They helped me. They helped my family and I when our son, Shani Lewis, was killed by police at the Royal Bethlehem.
Shani Lewis was a 23-year-old graduate with no previous history of mental illness. Within 18 hours of being taken to hospital, he was all but dead. His family buried him 2 years ago. Still, they wait for answers.
This was August bank holiday. He became quite agitated and paranoid, and so decided to go as a voluntary patient to the hospital to see what was wrong. And soon after we left, he wanted them to call us. He wanted to come home because he knew he could if he wanted to. But instead of calling us, they called the police. And they were asked to take him down to the seclusion room. And he didn't want to go, so he put his hands against the door frame to stop himself going in, to stop them taking him in. And they pushed him, and he fell down, and then they restrained him for about 45 minutes in 2 sets of restraint. Eventually, when his body went limp, which any person would know was a sign of distress, was a sign for CPR, medical intervention. The police thought he was pretending, faking it, so they left him on the floor to die. And our long journey, 7 years for an inquest to hear what actually happened to him, began. Yeah, 7 years.
It was awful, worst time of my life. Shani, my best friend, who was killed in 2010 at the hands of up to 11 police officers. It was disgusting. How can you tie him up while he's on the floor, sit on him, on his back? He couldn't breathe.
For a black person going through the inquest process, there are multiple challenges. There's always a question of whether they raise the issue of race. For many of the families we work with, they will be convinced, and rightly so, in most cases, that their loved one's race played a part in the way they were treated. But these processes and investigations don't look at race themselves.
Although of course they deny it, the police deny it, they denied it in the inquest, they wouldn't even let us bring it up. It was like the coroner said, the elephant in the room, but she still wouldn't let us bring it up. And but we know it does because it happens in too many cases. We've seen it happen,
The state's always going to deny institutional racism because it puts pressure on them to do something about it, and they don't want to see it as a bigger problem, and a problem that actually they are accountable for.
All the police see is a big, strong black man, and their minds go into overdrive. And the doctor said, in so many words, that it was like watching the police restrain an animal. He actually said that in the inquest. It's in the inquest notes. So that is how the police looked at any black body.
So some of the key cross-cutting issues in the deaths of black people is the brutality in which they're treated. How they're criminalised, and how somebody who might be in a mental health crisis is treated as somebody who is to be feared and is dangerous, rather than recognising the medical emergency that they may well be in.
Mr. Rigg had mental health problems and was acting erratically when he was arrested. His family say it was clear he was unwell, and what he really needed wasn't this, but treatment.
Basically, today's decision and the fact that somebody can restrain somebody in the prone position for 7 minutes has given the officers the licence to kill.
Sean was a young man who died from the effects of positional asphyxia, again being restrained, again at Brixton Police Station. This is over a decade after Wayne Douglas, and the same mistakes are being made. But then, in 2020, I did the case of Kevin Clark. So this is more than 2 decades later, and you have a young black man suffering from a mental illness in the crisis, and the police still restrain him in a similar way to Wayne Douglas had been restrained, to Sean Rigg had been restrained, and Kevin died from positional asphyxia because of the way he had been restrained, because lessons which should have been learned 2-3 decades before had been repeated.
Some of the key work that Aggie Lewis was doing was to push for the way people in mental health settings are treated and the recording of restraint in those settings. So as a casework team, we looked across our cases to see how many other similar examples we had to support the push for Cheney's Law.
Cheney's Law is an attempt to stop other people dying in mental health units, as he did, like he did. unfortunately, not everything has actually started, but most of it is working. And our job now is to talk about Cheney's law, to make sure each mental health unit is enforcing it, and there's training. Police, when they go into a mental health unit, should have body-worn cameras turned on. I think it's just to stop other people dying like he died.
What we know from our work on deaths in mental health settings is that restraint is disproportionately used by mental health staff against black people, women and children.
Her family describe Amy El-Kiria as a loving, warm, humorous teenager. At the same time, she had a history of complex mental health issues, Tourette's, ADHD, obsessive-compulsive disorder among them. At the age of 14, she was sectioned 100 miles away from home at the Priory's Ticehurst house in Sussex. On at least half a dozen occasions during her short stay, the 14-year-old was restrained and forcibly sedated. On the November evening Amy was found dying, the inquest jury decided staff delayed calling an ambulance, delayed contacting a doctor, delayed CPR, delayed getting emergency equipment. There was, the jury concluded, a real chance Amy would have survived but for those failings.
I've listened to the life stories of Stephen Lawrence, Wayne Douglas and Amy El-Kiria. Now I hear them crying for all of us. I hear so much when I stand for a minute of silence.
They burgle us, they mug us in the streets, they steal from our homes and our cars. We lock them away here in the suburbs of London, in this vast complex at Feltham. We're jailing more young criminals than almost any country in Western Europe.
I'm 15 and I went into prison, I couldn't believe it. It felt like hell. You couldn't really picture it. It's somewhere you don't want to be.
And then you go through a strip search and then you get put into a cell.
I couldn't sleep, so I had to make myself sleep, and that's by knocking myself out against the wall.
So at the time of working in the early 2000s on the deaths of 14-year-old Adam Rickwood, the youngest child to have died in state care, Gareth Myatt, who's 15, and Joseph Scholes, who was 16. And they were the most shocking examples of state violence and neglect and subjecting children to the most inhuman and degrading treatment. And I have to say, as Carol Pounder, who was Adam Rickwood's mother, said, if their parents had treated them in the way that the state treated them, they would have been prosecuted.
So Gareth Myatt, as I understood him, was a shy 15-year-old teenage boy, wasn't a violent person. He was a young child, okay, restrained by 3 officers at Rainsbrook Detention Centre, where they kept children, convicted children. And Gareth Myatt one day refused to clean the toaster. That was all he did. Got restrained, died, and directly because of the restraint. He's 15 years old, for God's sake.
Joseph Scholes died in a child prison, and I distinctly remember the shock of the inquest jury when prison staff brought into court the strip clothing that Joseph had been placed in as a highly vulnerable boy, extremely distressed, and put in the most inhuman strip clothing. It looked effectively like a horse blanket. He was naked underneath and he was left alone. His body only found by a workman who happened to be working on the wing that Joseph was in. The inquests reached highly critical conclusions into the three boys' deaths, and one telling moment for me was when one of the jurors, following the Adam Rickwood inquest, waited to see the family afterwards and turned round to me and said, "Why didn't we know what they were doing to children in the system?"
He shouldn't have been there. He didn't deserve to be there and get bullied. He always got bullied, didn't he? Always. Because he was vulnerable, because people knew that Jake were an emotional person. But they also, a lot of people thought, well, he's a big tough lad, he can take it, you know what I mean? But he couldn't.
My last words to him, because he was sat behind a glass panel, were, "Don't cry, son, don't cry." And he sent him back to Inley.
During the inquest into the death of Jake Hardy, his mother was asked, why she didn't do more to protect Jake. And her response was, "I kept my son alive for 16 years. You had him for 6 weeks, and he's dead." But for someone to reach a stage of 6 weeks of being in a prisoner state, they feel compelled to take their own life at the age of 17. That's shameful for this government. These are young people. This is how we treat them. This is how we let them die. It's a shameful indictment on how, the prisoner state does not work. But we were able to tie those trends and themes together to ensure that they were all fully explored in each and every inquest, leading to numerous recommendations. As a result of that work, we've had, we'd seen the deaths of children particularly stop for a long period.
My feet are tired of standing for 1 minute of silence. The way we lost Jake Hardy and Adam Rickwood makes silence very difficult for me. I know they did not go silently. I know that we have come to this because too many people are staying silent, so I will not close my eyes.
When I first worked with INQUEST, it was a tiny little organisation. There was, a couple of caseworkers, and today, INQUEST is expanded and it's doing the most amazing work, writing so many useful reports, providing support for so many families. The most significant one has to be access to legal aid.
It was a campaign that started from the inception of INQUEST, and it was only in 2021 that we won that campaign, but it still doesn't go far enough. So inequality of arms has improved, more to do. Disclosure of information prior to an inquest. When I first started, families had simply no disclosure of information at all. Now there is disclosure. There are now independent investigations conducted into deaths involving the police and in prisons, whilst by no means perfect, and there are many challenges with a lot of those investigations. However, the principle is there.
So one of the big improvements over the past decade or so is how evidence is gathered, and the work of the families and inquests in ensuring that police officers have to have body-worn cameras, the cameras in the back of police vans, CCTV footage in prison cells. But what it's actually helped to do is show that treatment continues. And we've got it documented now, so it's easier for families to be able to demonstrate that the way a person was treated was so brutal. Sadly, what we're not seeing is an improvement in how people are being treated.
So you will always need an organisation like INQUEST. Deaths aren't going to stop, are they? institutions aren't going to stop turning a blind eye or forgetting or think that's sorted, we'll move on. And then 5 years down the road, they're back at the same place they were before. That's what I've learned in 30 years in journalism. These are cyclical things.
There are so many families. We belong to a loose cooperative called United Family and Friends Campaign for those who died in state custody, which you just cannot help mix with all the families. You know, you just form a bond. There's a big bond, and we work together, we campaign together. Yeah, it's a family we don't want to be a member of, but unfortunately, we are.
The deaths and the pattern of deaths that we have documented for 40 years, you know, that evidence base is a really important one that drives our policy and campaign work for change. INQUEST's work has shone a light into some of the darkest corners of the state and has made visible issues that the state would rather keep secret. Our work has meant that families don't have to navigate these protracted and secret processes on their own, and it is their desires for change that continues to motivate our work for social and racial justice.